How are you? It's the start of our poetry section. I'll be grading your papers all day, and so start looking for some grades and comments on those. Haven't graded any of them yet, but we are beginning our poetry section in the second half of this course. And today we'll be talking about Emily Dickinson and Sylvia Plath, as well as sort of a little bit about how to read poetry. I also wanted to mention that you will have a quiz on poetry next Wednesday, that it will be online on Blackboard. Um, so look forward to that, and that'll, if you stay on these poems, you'll be all right for the quiz. There'll be short answers or multiple choice. I'll see how the format works on Blackboard. So keep on top of those. When you're reading poetry, it's the kind of thing, it can be a little bit like a puzzle, and you need to read it multiple times and figure out what the writer's up to. So don't give up on a poem too quickly. Don't write it off as stupid waste of time. I know that sort of general perception of poetry, but as you read it, as you become a more sophisticated reader, you're likely to get a lot more out of it. And most of the people who write off poetry as stupid are people who don't understand the poems, or can't read them with that extra analytical intensity that it takes to get what the poet was up to. So try to give it that extra time. You are a good enough reader to do this, so give it that extra brain power as you read it to get what it's trying to do. Okay, these two poets have some interesting parallels. They're both from, or at least spent significant amounts of time in Amherst, Massachusetts, in center of New England, central Massachusetts. In excuse me, in the case of Emily Dickinson, she was something of a recluse, living in her house and gardening for years right outside of Amherst, Massachusetts. In fact, a lot of her poetry you'll find is about the garden and sort of life and death and immortality within the walls of her estate, or her family's estate. Sylvia Plath also lived right across town in Northampton, which is the town next to Amherst, where she went to college in the 60s, and had a lot of the same life and death and immortality are certainly some of the same themes here. Now you'll notice they're also different in a lot of ways. Plath is a little bit darker, more nightmarish. Dickinson tends to have a lighter touch and also a very unique, distinctive style of her own, from everything from punctuation to capitalization to theme. Both of them were troubled. Both of them wrote about mental illness, Plath more overtly. Both of them were also feminists of a sort, though they wouldn't have fit into the social movements of their time. They were writing about women and women's, I hate to use the term women's issues, but they're writing about gender and gender roles, power, sexuality. Emily Dickinson, for a recluse who didn't have much of a social life, writes a lot about sex and love. So these are some of the themes that come in to both of them. Now, as you're reading poetry, I'm not going to give you a whole bunch of different terms that you have to memorize, but one thing to think about is meter. And meter is the bounce and rhythm of the line. So you'll notice as you're reading a line of poetry that some syllables are emphasized and some are not. And your mind's eye can sort of tell you which ones, and your mind's ear can tell you which ones as you're reading it. And you'll notice there's a certain rap or musical type rhythm that goes to rap for those of you who are hip-hop fans, musical rhythms for those of you who aren't, that go into this, the sound of poetry. And everything from punctuation to the line break go into sort of how that rhythm plays out. So as much as these are sort of mind puzzles, they are also musical. They're also sound poems. So try to think of that, hear it in your own head, or read it out loud, if that helps. Okay, Emily Dickinson. Let's see. These were written in, most of them, between 1862 and 1880. You'll notice that's the Civil War time. She was not particularly politically engaged, and yet the life or death aspect of her poetry is very much present. And the people around her, especially the Concord group, Emerson and Thoreau, and she was sort of a very ancillary part of that group, barely noticed by them, but was writing at the same time. Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, some of the other major writers of that time were also in Massachusetts. But she's doing her own thing, and she's writing stuff that other people can't really make much sense of at first. They don't understand why she's using so many dashes, why there's so much random capitalization. why she uses slant rhyme or half rhyme, which is where the rhyme doesn't quite match perfectly, but does have some of the same sound elements of other words. So this is not a typical. Sometimes it feels like it doesn't quite rhyme. It's almost worse than not rhyming at all. But she's playing with it, right? And so she has a certain sense of play with these words, of irony and humor. We'll see that even more strongly in Plath, whose irony and humor are darker, but also more evident, more sort of on the surface than Dickinson. One of her main themes seems to be that life in the garden can be ruthless, can be sort of tough. So, a narrow fellow in the grass is a snake. And, this is a poem about a snake in the grass. It's also, of course, a poem about the metaphor of the snake in the grass, the idea of betrayal and deception, of death, death's approach being sneaky and unknown and without warning. She does satirize. She does have some making fun of or mocking or doing parody of other poets or of sort of maudlin sensibilities that she sees, but she's mostly trying to write about what's going on in her own head and her own concerns about life, death, immortality, and a life in which other people aren't very present for her. Give her poems an extra read or two until you start picking up on these themes that she's trying to convey. And then turn over to Plath. And Plath is writing 100 years later in 1965. She's on page 931 of Abkarian, by the way. Your Dickinson starts on 1187. So with Plath, you've got, and I've put a recording, a link to a recording on both your announcement and your email of her reading Daddy just before her death. There's a number of video clips that go with it. Ignore those. Listen to the sound of her voice, how she reads it, where there's humor, where there's darkness, where there's the gothic. We see a lot of that here, even mixed in with humor, which is one of the things that makes her so special. This was, to give you a little bit about her life, Plath was a troubled but incredibly talented young poet when she went to Smith College in Massachusetts. In the midst of an explosion of writing and creativity, she decided to kill herself and took a bunch of pills and hid in a crawl space for 3 whole days before she was found. Survived it and went on to a certain amount of fame as a poet. She met the other successful poet, Ted Hughes, and was in and eventually married him. It was in a relationship with him. You'll see as you read Daddy some references to Hughes as a bit of a vampire, as something like a daddy figure, who drove her to commit suicide again. And maybe it's not, you can't say Ted Hughes drove her, but she eventually did commit suicide, and Daddy was not published until after. So she died in 1863. Daddy came out in 65, even though it had been written in 1962. Her own father died with something of a, it's not clear what he was. You get a sense for how she felt about him and how she may use hyperbole or overstatement to sort of make him into a larger-than-life figure. He died when she was 8, and clearly his loss was a major part of her trouble. She writes about Daddy on one hand as if she hates him and that he has cursed her. On the other, you can see the deep love and pain that it came from his early death, when she was 8 years old. So in a way, it's the love for him and her good feeling for him that make it so dark and so painful for her later. She wrote a novel called The Bell Jar, which is still very popular, and became what's known as a confessional poet. Dickinson is less of a confessional poet than Plath. In Plath, it's very much writing about her own life and drawing larger conclusions from it. So even as she is writing about things like feminism and sexuality, about life and death and suicide and why we live, why we die, that sort of thing, she's also being sort of this nightmarish domestic surreal where things look normal on the surface but are much darker and more nightmarish and gothic than that underneath. So she's writing about mental illness, about feeling condemned. And the strange feeling when you're listening to her read her poetry is that it's coming from beyond the grave in some way. Let's see. Look for her humor and irony too. It's there. So as you read this, try to find that. As you hear the language and the music of it, also try to see where she's winking at you, where she's sort of making some fun here. We don't think of poetry as doing that, but this is what she is doing with poetry. And it's important that you sort of start to get that more sophisticated read on it. Read Daddy a couple times, once before you watch the video of her recounting it, once after. And I think you'll get a lot more out of it that way. This one has a lot to be found. Okay, I think I will leave it there for you. Please, I know that you may not really jump into the poetry till early next week, but remember that I do need one primary blog post and at least 4 comments for this week, as well as your papers, which I'll be grading. And then next week we'll have a full week of reading, starting with 2 days of poetry and 6 different poets, and then we'll jump into nonfiction. Your quiz will come after the second day of poetry. It'll be due that night, Wednesday night. Keep in touch. Send me an email. I'll see you on the blogs. Look for your grades and comments on your papers, and have a great day. Thanks a lot for listening.